I'm your host, Brett King, and joining us this week to talk about the forthcoming book, Tech Money, is Igor Pejic. Igor's coming to us from Vienna, Austria today. We thought this would be a good chance to talk about the fact that, we've talked about this on the show previously, but the fact that today, the tech giants of today, including the largest privately owned companies in the world, SpaceX and, of course, OpenAI, these guys have so much cash and so much influence in terms of policy today that they're more powerful than most governments. This is certainly true of players like Apple, Facebook, Meta, and Google and other players in the mix as well. In fact, if you listen to various commentators, such as Ian Bremmer, the well-known political commentator from Eurasia Group, running out of New York, he calls this an emerging technology Cold War, because the tech players in the US versus the technology players in countries like China now have so much control of the conversation that it's really determining much of our futures, certainly from a geopolitics perspective, certainly from a social media perspective. And this shifts us from, traditional industrial age conflicts, geopolitical considerations, industrial age warfare, to where software-driven conflict is rewriting the economics of war and also the investment strategies that go with it. So, Igor, first of all, welcome to the show. Let's start with what's happening in the region where I am. I'm in Dubai, obviously, so the Iran conflict. But let's also talk about the situation in Ukraine and how these technology-based companies, like Palantir and so forth, are pushed into the mix right now from a trading perspective, but also a platform perspective.
I really liked what you mentioned in the introduction, the word platform and paradigm, which is really what we're seeing happening now on the battlefield and the defense sector more broadly. And I really like to look at the defense sector at this moment, because what is happening there is what tech is basically doing to any industry. It has done to a couple of industries and will do to some others still to come, namely not just to enhance them and then provide their tech, but basically to rewrite the rules of how things are done, how companies are competing, and also how investors are making and losing money. So let's look a little bit in more detail to what you mentioned in what's happening in Ukraine and now with the war against Iran. And what we're seeing on the battlefield is actually the end of an era and the end of certain mechanisms of war and war economics that have been there, well, basically since the beginning of humankind, right? Because we are entering the software age. Just to give you the most striking example, there's something called the defense stock paradox, right? Which basically tells you that when usually we would expect that stocks would rise and be the best profiteers of war, because of course all of a sudden you have excessive demands for the company's products, you have a huge negotiation power on terms of those contractors, but that's not what's happening. That hasn't been happening throughout history. If you look at aircraft manufacturers in the U.S. Pre-Pearl Harbor, they were outperforming the market in expectation of conflict. But as soon as the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, all the way to 1945, when the war was over, they significantly underperformed the market. And this has mainly to do with the supply and demand problem, because there's a huge demand, but new supply of everything that you need in war is very limited and very hard to get. And I'm not talking only about stealth bombers and nuclear submarines. I'm also talking about more basic stuff. And this is where Ukraine comes in, like shells and munitions. And we've been hearing this for years, that it's very difficult to ramp up this production. The U.S. military, for example, the Department of Defense, wanted to go up to 100,000 artillery rounds per month, they're still at a capacity of 40,000. And if the US has this problem, basically everybody else has it too. So it's very, very difficult to scale. You have these constraints of staff, of the whole production plans, of the material, or international supply chain. And now you look at the tech side of war, which is increasingly becoming more important. And you don't have, or for most of the part, you don't have these restrictions. If you look at, you mentioned Palantir, what they're doing with their deep AI research, this is software, right? So with every new unit, it's very easy to add. There's no limit, and also the economics of war are changing. So with every new unit, you have this almost zero marginal costs, which means that the business case is actually improving the more you scale up. And we're seeing this now with the war in Iran, because since it broke out, the traditional legacy war manufacturers or defense manufacturers have not been doing so well. Certainly nothing that we would have expected. Whereas companies like Palantir are up a couple of percent. Red Cat Holdings, who is a drone manufacturer, other private companies like Anduril who do automation platforms, they're performing very well. And this is because we have introduced a new software and AI paradigm to the battlefield. And this is changing the whole rules of how things are going.
I did hear an episode of All In, the All In podcast the other week, where two executives from Palantir and Anduril were on talking about the autonomous factories that they're setting up for munitions development, and the way the defense buying has changed in respect to software and AI. But I think it sort of goes back to more of that. I mean, we are talking about now, sort of this asymmetry in terms of the cost of warfare. In Dubai, of course, we have had attempted attacks from Iran frequently over the past weeks, and we're talking about a drone that can be manufactured for 20 or 30,000, having to be intercepted by these THAAD interceptors, which have, diminishing stockpiles and cost millions of dollars per interception. And I think we saw evidence of this in the Russia-Ukraine conflict early in the piece as well, where, you saw these very low cost operations, running off effectively, cell phone softwares and, a few $1,000s worth of drone equipment. But from a systemic perspective, we're seeing, military's always been on that edge of, pushing what's technically possible. I mean, the advances we made during the Second World War, for example, in respect to computing and all of these things, warfare's always been a great technology impetus. So is it just that, or are we seeing a fundamental shift in the way, warfare and defense is sort of structured?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both. On the one hand, you're right, war is the biggest engine of innovation, and I'm saying this, sitting in the heart of Europe. I'm constantly asking, why is Europe not, for example, keeping up with innovation? Why doesn't it have big tech and all of these other great technology companies? And my answer is primarily because we never had a real big military. Right? America has DARPA, the Defense Department's research arm, which has basically led to most breakthrough technologies. You've mentioned World War II, but it's also in peacetime. Things like GPS, like the internet, like encryption. All of those things come from the military because they work by different standards, have different budgets, have a clear objective, and so on. So, of course, it is turbocharging innovation in a way as well. But I think it's also a paradigmatic shift, as I said, because we are now leaving these physical constraints that we have had. And you mentioned drones. Drones are a great example. And I think they have also changed the nature of conflicts. It's now the asymmetry between militarily very strong or rich country and a smaller country, it's very, very difficult to invade a smaller country or attack it, which I hope down the road will deter invasions in the future. But we're seeing this in particular in Ukraine, Ukraine that has mastered drone technology like no other country, right? So they're defending themselves, even though they have so much smaller fighting population, and they're extremely successful at it. On the other hand, it can also lead to a lot of these gray areas where you're not sure if is this a conflict, or will it lead to escalations. For example, Russia sending drones to airports in Europe, and as you said, you can shoot it down, but then you just lose a couple of $1 million worth of ammunition. So it is really changing the asymmetry, and the asymmetry is also exacerbating what I said earlier, this paradox, this defense stock paradox, by making these supply problems more difficult. Because if you're using a $20,000 drone to destroy a tank or a fighter jet or a submarine, it's very, very difficult to rebuild this and replenish it in due time. So I think we're really seeing a fundamental shift in the defense sector, something that we haven't seen, even if you look at history, we had armies fighting with swords and then with spears and guns and so on. But there was always this physical limitation that today we don't have anymore to that point. Sure, we have drone hardware and so on, and we have low orbit satellites, but most of the value in those things is software.
But I mean, we do have the ability to make the supply chain much more efficient with AI, theoretically, and I'm sure there's a ton of work going into that from an autonomous perspective. So there's that side. That gap may close in respect to that. But how much of the driver of autonomous warfare, using robotics in the field, using autonomous aircraft and autonomous vehicles, how much of that is a supply chain calculation versus, just a more efficient use of manpower, or resources?
It's definitely a supply chain issue as well, especially if you look at the different layers of this technology, right? Because everybody's talking about AI, and AI is the best example of those different layers. You need those all the way from rare earth minerals to those fabs that are creating the chips, which is TSMC, which unfortunately could become another theater of war, to those chip architecture providers like NVIDIA, to the LLM providers. So there's many different layers, and most of them are spread geopolitically. So it is a big supply chain issue, and we're seeing this tremendous push as well to insource or inshore these supply chains in the U.S. now. Especially under the current administration, there has been an attempt to for example, lure TSMC to create fabs in the U.S. Also, there's huge investments in Intel, the big American hope to create those very basic form of chips. So I think that supply chains are still becoming more complex, and the trouble is that they're facing a lot of challenges, whether that's war or whether it's tariffs and sanctions. So it is getting tougher and tougher. So definitely we are not in a complete software world. So the physical aspect of it, even for software, is there and will always stay there.
I think from a valuation perspective, what we're just seeing is as we've seen in banking is a great example of this, where in banking you've seen, the next generation of banks, the valuations are a little lower than the big industrial banks, the blue chip banks. Having said that, many of the neobanks and the digital platforms in the space, players like Stripe and Adyen, these guys rival in terms of valuation some of the certainly medium sized banks of the world. But the valuation metrics tend to look a lot more like technology companies in terms of scaling, revenue multiples, and things like that. Versus, whereas traditional banks were looking at, cost to income ratio, and those sort of various measures, because software makes fintechs and these technology players much more efficient and much more scalable. So when you're looking at returns on investment, you're looking at that scalability issue. How does that apply in this space?
Yeah, it's certainly again the same, just the same mechanism as I said, because those fintechs and neobanks. I mean, banking is a bit of a tricky example because you have this legal status of being a bank. So Revolut, for example, would have a bank license, so technically it's a bank, but generally those new challengers that are built around technologies that I would still classify as tech companies, they behave completely different to traditional companies or traditional stocks, and you mentioned some of the banks, but the same can be said for any other company that a value investor would have looked at, right? If you look, let's say Coca-Cola, you exactly know what's the market size. You can, you could push it by 5%. You could get some market share of the competitor. You can be more efficient. But if you're looking at companies like Revolut, for example, you never know what else will be their total addressable market. It can change overnight, for example. And you mentioned this one thing implicitly, which is exponentiality. That's what all of the tech investors are pricing in. And that's what makes tech investments so difficult. And that's why we're seeing, these traditional metrics, price to earnings, for example, that's on paper, these stocks appear very, very expensive. But that's because we're using old methodologies that were prevalent in the 20th century in this value investing paradigm to value companies that behave differently. And tech is also causing a paradigm shift in terms of investing and how you choose stocks. Just to give you some numbers, so all the way until the end of the 1990s, if you compared value stocks to growth stocks, value stocks usually outperformed growth stocks, and that's why Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and all of these other big investors were so successful. But something happened, during the rise of the internet, and it was not even changed during the dot-com bubble and the bursting of it. It still remained that all of a sudden those growth stocks, i.e. tech companies, were outperforming them. And the outperformance was just increasing exponentially. So today there is no way to measure returns or compare them realistically of value stocks to tech stocks. So tech stocks are just exponentially more successful as a category than traditional stocks. And that's maybe just the last sentence. That's because we are living in a tech age. And from here on, and that's a major hypothesis also in my book, is that it will get only more technological. Because if we look at the acceleration of tech breakthroughs and the acceleration of tech adoption, it's just going one way, right?
I'm interested in how agentic AI applies here because, we do obviously have, apart from physical warfare and, weapons being used, we have this massive cyber warfare going on around the world. But how much of that is done by private companies, and are those private companies investable? There's so companies who are actually involved in cyber warfare infrastructure, and are there private companies involved directly in that field?
They definitely are. They definitely are. So I think it's both the governments are doing a part, but also private companies. For investors, there is a tricky part, or it is always tricky to invest in companies that have as their customers mainly the government, because it's very difficult to judge, the quality of the products, and especially when we're talking about war. The only time when you really know if a company's product is good is when you employ it in war, right? So if you have an encryption company, it might be having great government contracts, but we know when war starts and the enemy is basically breaking the codes, then all of a sudden you realize, well, maybe this was not the best investment. So all of those cryptographic companies, they are kind of a very high risk, but also high reward play, of course. But it's rather a risk-on strategy.
Understand. Well, Igor, we need to take a quick break. But before we do, what we like to do on the show is ask a few quick fire questions so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better. Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah.
So let's do that. This is the lightning round. What was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to through media, TV, books, movies?
It was definitely Star Wars.
What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
Writing.
Is there a futurist or an entrepreneur that has particularly influenced you in your career or your life, and why?
Depends if previous ones count as well. I would say Nikola
Of
Tesla,
course.
me being a creation. So
Yep.
I'm a big fan of Tesla.
Awesome. And finally, is there a science fiction story or some world that's being created in that space that's most representative of the future you hope for or you think is possible?
I think rather one that is possible. I always liked the novel Gattaca and the movie, which is a rather dark possibility of what could happen, but I think it is possible.
We're on the cusp of a lot of gene editing and gene therapy right now, so it's certainly possible. Igor, we've talked extensively about the defense industry, and you have, of course, got into previously talking about not just AI, but blockchain, crypto, and elements like that. How does that come into play in terms of sort of the world of tokenization and the digital sort of twin concept of warfare? How are we seeing that play out from a perspective of company value and new companies emerging?
Yeah, so definitely you're addressing one of the big drivers, I think, that of technology in general, but especially on the battlefield, which is a concept called technological fusion, right? So you mentioned a couple of those there. Technologies are increasingly growing together, right? We have blockchain, for example, that is there to protect communication, to have resilience. So there's a lot of benefits that the blockchain can actually add to the battlefield. We have AI, which is leading to a massive autonomy, not just automation, but autonomy of drones, of other robots, and so on. But there's also other technologies. So I think one of the big drivers of warfare will be, especially if we think 10, 20 years down the road, will be the expansion to space, right? So we've seen tremendous expansion into space over the last couple of years. Maybe the average person did not notice it, but just if you look at the number of satellites that we shot up, thanks to Elon and all of the reusable Falcon rockets and so on, now, I mean, SpaceX is about 8,000 low orbit satellites in the sky, and it's just getting more and more. Amazon with Project Kuiper will get there by 2030. They'll have also 4,000 up there. So I think a lot of that will be moved to space. A lot of the compute, a lot of the brains of and the operations of war will be moved up there, and the last thing that I see is also, and that's something that I hope for, that those autonomous systems will more or less lead to material against material, so where we have less human casualties. Of course, that's a hope. We never know if this will turn out, but ideally, you have drones fighting drones and not people fighting people.
I mean, that's the argument that, the founders of Palantir and Anduril and others make, right? But at the same time, and this is why we have a debate going on in global governance circles right now about the automation of weapons and whether there should be limits to that, humans in the loop, and so forth. I'm interested in the militarization of space, particularly with the fact that we've just had the Artemis 2 mission successfully flying around the moon for the first time in, 50 years. But Jared Isaacman, who is, of course, himself a veteran of spaceflight, having flown on 2 SpaceX missions, one was the first commercial spacewalk, is now the administrator of NASA and talking about putting a moon base on the moon. And if you're a fan of Apple TV, you've probably watched the series For All Mankind, which is a alternate timeline version of the US versus Russia space race, where they end up first colonizing the moon, then colonizing Mars. But initially, part of the real conflict or issue was that the moon bases were both in this a fictitious representation of the world were manned by military personnel. And then, of course, you had the militarization of the moon. And that's certainly got to be something that is a realistic possibility given Russia, sorry, not Russia, but China and the US are both trying to get back to the moon right now.
Yeah, definitely. So having and establishing a moon base is something that has this typical dual use purpose. On the one hand, as you mentioned, military, but on the other hand, and I think that's perhaps just as an important driver as the commercial one. So if we get to really to things like mining rocks on different planets and the moon, that's something that could be a real incentive to go up there. That's something that could mobilize a lot of private capital as well, because now we are mostly government funded. And yeah, there could be a clash outside. So I really like Jeff Bezos's concept of, this blue origin, that we are in the cradle, right? And hopefully this will stay rather peaceful, and whatever conflicts we have or whatever measurements are then outsourced to other planets, or also, heavy industry that's kind of destroying the atmosphere and these kind of things, to outsource this to space. So I think it holds a lot of promise. Of course, when there's promise, there's also peril, but I'm rather optimistic, despite having been influenced by Star Wars, which is rather a dark vision of the future. But I think if we look back at the history of humanity, we always had technology improving our state, and I think it's definitely true with space. And there's no question if and how we should go, but just how quickly can we get there.
Being a fan of sci-fi, I was quite intrigued to see that someone had actually done the math on if the Star Trek and Star Wars environments were to, those universes were to merge, who would have the most powerful military force. And it turns out that the phases on the Enterprise, for example, and the photon torpedoes that they use, the quantum torpedoes, etc., were orders of magnitude more powerful than the munitions used by the Star Wars universe. So that's a little bit of a statistical aside for you, fictitious, of course. But let's looking out to, say, 2050. How does this change the global defense industry, and what is are we, is war going to be less popular? I'm asking you to do some forecasting here. We've seen not a lot of public support right now for the wars that are occurring globally. Of course, I don't think that's been the case ever, that there's been broad public support, maybe with the exception of the Second World War, but the Vietnam War, the Iraq, the Persian Gulf conflicts all had massive protests against them. But what does warfare look like in the 2050s? Is it still there, or and is it fully automated? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think in terms of how much warfare do we get, I think it really depends not so much on technological factors this time, but rather on sociological and socioeconomic ones, because we know from the history, and that's political science, the more democratic a society is, the less they want to go to wars, right? So in the ages where they were kings and absolute leaders, it's very easy to send troops, but it's very difficult to explain this to a democratic populace, especially, if you're not defending yourself. That's a different thing, of course. So the question is, will the world get more democratic or less democratic over the next 30 years, 25 years? Well, if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said, of course. Today, I'm not so sure anymore.
But now, it's I mean, as a futurist, I think there's some advantages to be had with these benevolent autocratic governments that are single party. They don't have the bipolar system sort of deal with in terms of political decision making, so they can move a lot quicker. When you're in an environment where technologies are ramping up very quickly, the ability to apply those to create better life for your citizens would, an autocratic government would have certain advantages. I mean, I see that in the environment I'm here in Dubai. It's a very people-oriented government system. They're really working to improve quality of life. Emiratis are big fans of their government, and rightly so, because it's improved quality of life for them significantly over the last couple of decades. The Chinese citizens seem to be big fans of the Chinese government generally. You have examples like Singapore and Saudi, examples there. So if you were to choose an environment for as a futurist to be in a space where you're using tech to improve the quality of life, then removing bureaucracy is a key element. But couldn't we do that with autonomy at scale anyway, right? So I know I'm just riffing on this, but what do you, in terms of stuff that's really experimental, you talked about some of the fact that we're testing things in the, the defense sphere right now, but in terms of stuff that's really highly experimental, that could be big technological advances in 10 or 20 years' time, what should we be looking at?
So I think the number one that comes to mind is obviously quantum computing and the quantum age, because it could just radically disrupt everything that we have today, from, going to the ATM to cryptocurrencies to communication like WhatsApp. Everything could be broken in an instant. This is one of the things we could solve tremendous problems on the other hand. So this would just mean a radical shift. On the other hand, but nobody knows if we will get there in 10, 20 years, because we're still, we don't know if we will be able to reach a state of quantum supremacy because of the problems that we're having with quantum particles and so on. The other big thing I think is really gen tech and biotech, and where do we get by, tailoring our genes and so on. So I think here it's more of kind of a societal approach, and I think that maybe gets back a little bit to what you said about forms of government, right? Because sometimes this consensus is holding you back, but it's also preventing you from big mistakes. So that's kind of a question of how fast we will move there. Of course, ever since we got CRISPR technology, this gene editing tech that later went on to win the Nobel Prize, then ever since that, we have the technological tools to go in that direction, and we're moving there. But we're moving very slowly, of course, because we can break a lot of things. But if we manage to tailor genetics, not just of humans, but of, there's researchers who are gene editing bugs to do a certain things, to control the climate, so that there's basically endless possibilities that you can get there. So I think these are the two big areas. And GenTech, for me, is interesting because it's one of those breakthrough technologies that is not IT-based, right? So it's something completely different. Of course, feeding off AI and so on, but it's not tailoring the digital space, but really the physical space. And this could be for the first time where we humans can engineer who we are at a much different level.
Certainly, I think cybernetics as well, like we're talking about brain control interfaces like Neuralink and things like that, but military, because of injuries, has been huge. We've seen huge advancements in robotic or prosthesis, prosthetics, exosuits, things like that. Augmented warfare could be certainly a big thing. It's not just genetic enhancements. It could be, combining, cybernetics. Imagine being able to call up a head-up display in your field of view, or have enhanced hearing, and things like this. There's certainly that has a biological imperative from a gene therapy perspective, but also potentially integrating, cybernetics. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities. Igor, tell us about your book and when it comes out, how people can find out more about what you're discussing, and check out more information about the book.
Sure. So the book is called Tech Money. It's basically teaching investors, retail investors, but also corporate investors and corporate managers of how to ride the waves of new emerging and also frontier technologies to benefit from them. You can basically find it at any major book retailer. It's coming out May 26th. And if you want to dive deeper on it, just go to my website, igorpejic.net, or just Google Igor Pejic and Tech Money, and I'm sure you will end up there anyway. So make sure to get it. Be the first one to order it.
Great. So that's Igor Pejic. It's IGORPEJIC.net if you want to check out more information about either Igor or the new book, Tech Money. Igor, thanks for joining us on the show today. I appreciate your input. Who, if you're going to pick one stock that we should be interested in looking at in terms of who's going to ride this wave of innovation that you've been talking about, who would it be?
Always weary of giving financial advice, but I was always a big fan of Amazon, and then Jeff Bezos. I think he has continuously win, and I think that winners keep winning, and I see a lot of potential in his business models and Amazon's business models, and also with the possible merger of Blue Origin. So really excited about what lies ahead for them.
Well, certainly Blue Origin and SpaceX have reduced the cost to orbit significantly. We're talking by magnitudes. With the new Starship program, could be down to hundreds of dollars per kilogram to orbit, which is a real game changer. So space is the future of investing for sure in many ways. Thanks for joining us today on the show, and we wish you all the success with your book launch.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, that's it for this week, guys. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Stay tuned. Obviously, we'll be back next week with more of the same. I want to reach out and say thank you to the team at Provoke Media for their excellent support. Kevin Hershen on the editing desk, Lisbeth Severins is our producer, and the entire team that helps us put the show together. You've been listening to another episode of Breaking Banks, and we'll be back next week. Until then, we'll see you in the future. That's it for another week of the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. This episode was produced by our US-based production team, including producer Lisbeth Severins, audio engineer Kevin Hersham. If you like this episode, don't forget to tweet it out or post it on your favorite social media, or leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever it is that you listen to our show. Those actions help other people find our podcast, and in return, that helps us build an audience that can be supported by sponsorship so we can continue to provide you with our award-winning content every week. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you on Breaking Banks next week.